Okay, so just turned 2 o'clock, so I want to start on time for everybody who's on, and certainly people will be joining us, I imagine. So I am Dr. Josephine Connolly-Schoonen. I'm the director of the nutrition division here at Stony Brook Medicine, as well as of our dietetic internship program. And on behalf of myself, Lorraine Danowski, Kara Montesano, and Sharon Schmidt, we'd like to thank all of our preceptors for the tremendous amount of work and effort you put into preparing the next generation of RDs. It's incredibly important work, and we really thank you for your time in doing so. I'd like to introduce Steven Biamonte. Steven is a dietitian here at Stony Brook Medicine. He's a graduate of our dietetic internship program, currently working on his master's, and has been with us in the inpatient, with the inpatient team for about 3 years. And Steven's going to be presenting some of the work that we're sharing today, and then perhaps also some personal experience, because Steven has tried has an interest in the ketogenic diet and has some good experience with it to share. And I'll be, especially towards the end, sharing some experience with using the ketogenic diet for our patients with epilepsy. Okay, so ketogenic diets are increasingly discussed for treating weight or obesity, type 2 diabetes, cancer or glioblastoma, Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's disease, other neurodegenerative diseases, as well as historically used for the treatment of epilepsy. Today, we're going to be focusing on obesity, type 2 diabetes, and epilepsy, with a little bit on the neurocognitive issues with the very last slide that I have. So before we jump into the studies on the diet therapy, just to review a bit about energy metabolism, because ketones, of course, relate to that. So about 4 or 5 slides on this. So this is the anaerobic glycolytic energy system. So in this system, we can only use glucose as a substrate for ATP production, and it does not require oxygen. So in this system, we go from glucose to pyruvate. Glucose is 6 carbons, pyruvate is 3. So you end up with 2 3-carbon molecules of pyruvate. And pyruvate can lead to the production of lactic acid. It especially when it can't enter the Krebs cycle, which we'll talk about in a moment. It can lead to a buildup of lactic acid and a decrease in pH, which is indicative of mitochondrial dysfunction. So we'll measure lactic acid sometimes to look at mitochondrial dysfunction syndromes. In terms of the aerobic energy system, here we have glucose going down to pyruvate, but now pyruvate can be further metabolized to acetyl-CoA, and acetyl-CoA enters the Krebs cycle by combining with oxaloacetate. So glucose via pyruvate is needed to produce both the acetyl-CoA as well as the oxaloacetate. And then we go through the Krebs cycle and we peel off these NADHs and FADH2s, which then get shuttled off to the electron transport chain. And here is where the majority of the ATP is produced. It is important to note that amino acids can enter in some ways, some amino acids can lead to pyruvate, some can lead to acetyl-CoA, and others can, after having the nitrogen removed, enter in various spots in the Krebs cycle. And then fatty acids can be used as a source for acetyl-CoA. So with beta oxidation, you take off 2 carbon units at a time, basically acetyl-CoA from the long chain carbon unit that makes up the fatty acid. So you peel off these acetyl-CoAs 2 carbons at a time. And then fatty acids can be a source of acetyl-CoA as well. So that's going to come into play in further in our discussion. With this, you get 38 ATPs per glucose. And then for fatty acids, depending on the chain length of the fatty acid, for an 18 carbon fatty acid, you get 147 ATPs. So if oxygen is available and you could go through the electron transport chain, you get a lot of ATP from fats. However, if oxygen is a limiting factor and we can't go through here, then we limit our ATP production. Okay, so what are ketones and how and where are they made? So ketones are largely made in the liver, and they're made from the acetyl-CoA units that come off of a fatty acid through beta oxidation. And 2-acetyl-CoAs are used to produce acetyl-CoA, and then another one is added, and then that becomes HMG-CoA. I'm sorry, that becomes 3-hydroxy-3-methyl-glutyl-CoA. That's the enzyme. This enzyme necessary for this step is the rate-limiting enzyme, and it's very much impacted by insulin and the counter-regulatory hormone glucagon. So insulin will put the brakes on this. So when you are eating carbohydrates and you are producing insulin, you will not make ketones, or not very many of them, because insulin will stop this, okay? But in a low insulin state, like when you're on a ketogenic diet and you're not taking in much carbohydrate and therefore your insulin is low, then you'll make a lot of ketones. This happens in the mitochondria, but this 3-hydroxy-3-methyl-glutyl-CoA, HMG-CoA, if it's acted upon by HMG-CoA reductase, you will use that to synthesize cholesterol in the cytosol, but it's also a step in the ketone production. So that's in the liver, in the mitochondria. And then we can further go down this pathway to make acetoacetate, which is a ketone. And acetoacetate can have spontaneous degradation into acetone, which is then exhaled. So when you're making a lot of ketones, some of them will just spontaneously turn into acetone and be exhaled. So you can actually smell this on someone's breath. I have a niece who has a mitochondriopathy, and when she was a baby, that was one of the first things I noticed. It really does smell. Everyone says it smells like nail polish remover. It really does smell like nail polish remover. And that's a sign that someone is making a lot of ketones. And then the acetoacetate can be further metabolized to synthesize beta-hydroxybutyrate. And this is the most abundant keto acid, and it's exported out of the liver to the blood, but it's synthesized in the liver. So you have the synthesis of the ketones in the liver. The beta-hydroxybutyrate goes into the blood, and then it can be taken into peripheral tissues to enter into the central nervous system. There are specific carriers, but in other peripheral tissues, it can doesn't require a carrier. And then in these peripheral tissues, the ketones can be used for energy. So we kind of reverse what we just said. The beta-hydroxybutyrate goes down to acetoacetate, and then eventually to the acetyl-CoAs. So these acetyl-CoAs then can enter the Krebs cycle, as we mentioned before, but you still need the oxaloacetate for the acetyl-CoA to join and to go into the TCA cycle. And in terms of ATP production, you get, depending on if you use acetoacetate or beta-hydroxybutyrate, 23 to 26 moles of ATP. So a decent amount of ATP is synthesized from each ketone. This does not happen in the liver, so the liver does not use ketones for energy. This enzyme is not present. Okay, so just to review a little bit, so whether acetyl-CoA is going to be used to make ketones or not, it could be also used to make fatty acids, and it can also be oxidized. So in this diagram, well, we'll start up on top. So we're looking at the ratio of oxaloacetate to acetyl-CoA. So if there's a 1-to-1 ratio, then you could make amino acids, you could make some ketones, and you can also use it to produce energy, to oxidize. If acetyl-CoA is limited, though, then you're not going to make fatty acids nor ketones, because you need a lot of acetyl-CoA to make ketones, especially, and you'll tend to use it more for oxidation. But if there's a lot of acetyl-CoA, so your insulin is low, and you could produce a lot of the acetyl-CoA, then you are going to predominantly make ketones. So if the acetyl-CoA there's a lot of acetyl-CoA relative to the OAA. It's a little harder to get in here because you don't have too much oxaloacetate. So acetyl-CoA is going to be used to make a lot of ketones and maybe some triglycerides. Okay, now a lot on here. We're going to break it down, but when you are not diabetic, when you're not type 1 diabetic and you are making some insulin, so you have a relative insulin deficiency state, perhaps with insulin resistance, but you're not a type 1 diabetic, so you're making insulin, you don't go into the DKA, because I think there's that misconception that if we are on a ketogenic diet and we're making ketones, we're gonna go into DKA. So that's not going to happen. With an absolute insulin deficiency like type 1 diabetes, where you really aren't making any, then there is an increase in lipolysis, breakdown of fat. You release the free fatty acids, go to the liver. You can make ketones, you have increased ketone production, or the free fatty acids can be used to make triglycerides. With the ketone production, you use up your alkali reserve and you become acidotic, so you have ketoacidosis. As well as high triglycerides. In addition, there'll be an increase in counter-regulatory hormones, and you have a decrease in protein synthesis, an increase in protein breakdown, and you use the amino acids from the protein breakdown as gluconeogenic substrates, and you make glucose. And that glucose goes into the blood. But again, if there's an absolute insulin deficiency, it can't go into the cells. So you end up with hyperglycemia, and you have the spillover of glucose through the kidneys, and you excrete it, and you become dehydrated, and you lose water and electrolytes with that, and impaired renal function. So this is all part of DKA. But on the right-hand side is what we're right up here is what we're doing on a ketogenic diet, where you have a relative insulin. Well, before we say ketogenic diet, if you're a type 1 diabetic and you have a relative insulin deficiency, you're making some, but for the amount of resistance you have, it's not enough. So you still have an inadequate amount of glucose, and the amount of ketones you make is going to depend a little bit on the degree of how much insulin you're making, because remember, insulin turns off that rate limiting step, that enzyme to make ketones. So it's a very, it's dependent on the person, and if they're making a lot of insulin, or if a type 2 diabetic is prolonged in their disease, they might actually not make that much insulin. Okay, and so you don't get this whole scenario on the left. But if there's low insulin, or you're taking in so little carbs that you're not promoting the production of insulin, so therefore it's low, then you can make the ketones, and you'll have ketones, but you still get some glucose, and you still get some glucose into the cell. So you're not going to get the DKA on the left.
Excuse me, sorry.
Sure.
Can you explain to me why type 1 diabetic would be in that situation even without insulin? Because, I mean, if you're just eating a normal diet, you would be absorbing fats at a relatively slow state. You would probably take them into your fat cells. I don't see how you would be breaking down so many free fatty acids that you would get ketoacidosis. I think a lot of type 1 diabetics use the diet quite successfully to lower their insulin intake.
Oh, I'm not talking about using the diet at this state. I'm just talking about a type 1 before they're diagnosed.
Oh, sorry, you're talking about somebody on a normal.
Upon when they're first developing type 1 diabetes, they're not taking insulin and they're untreated. This is how they present in the ER, right, with DKA for a type 1. I'm not talking about on a ketogenic diet.
Oh, okay.
Because on a ketogenic diet, they'd probably still be taking insulin. They would need a lot less, but they wouldn't get into this scenario.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay. Okay. And this is just a reminder, it'll come up later in some of the labs that we have to check for patients that we put on a true ketogenic diet, like a real classic ketogenic diet to treat epilepsy. In order for your long chain fatty acids to get into the mitochondria, in order for beta oxidation to occur, you have to have a carnitine transporter. So carnitine is essential. So if someone's going to do a classic ketogenic diet and really depend on ketones or the production of ketones, we should really check their carnitine levels. And if they're low, we should supplement with carnitine. Okay, so this is from the Charlie Foundation. The source is on the bottom. So now we're going to be talking about diet. And there's many different flavors or versions of a ketogenic diet, right? So the classic ketogenic diet has a ratio of 4:1, meaning 4 grams of fat to every 1 gram of carb and protein combined. So it's very low. It's got just enough protein, very low carb. I'll show you some examples later on, and lots and lots and lots of fat. So on a plate, it's nicely depicted here. So 90% fat, 6% protein, 4% carb, roughly. If you're going to now go to a 3-to-1 ratio, so still kind of a classic ketogenic diet, but now you only have 3 grams of fat to every 1 gram of carb protein combined, or the modified, you can go down to a 1-to-1, like a modified Atkins kind of that's down here, sorry. More like a 1-to-1, huge range here. So it can be helpful to start if you want to treat somebody on a ketogenic diet and monitor their ketones, because we've learned that we used to start on the 4-to-1, but now we've learned to start on maybe a 3-to-1, 2.5-to-1, and monitor ketones. And maybe they don't need to go to a 4-to-1. And some of our articles will talk about that. So now you're getting about 82% fat, 12% protein, 6% carbs. There's a version where you use lots of MCT oil. The medium chain triglycerides don't require that carnitine transporter, so they get into the mitochondria much more quickly and then more ketogenic. So that's emphasizing the use of MCT. Modified Atkins limits the amount of carbohydrate, encourages fat, but does not limit protein. So you might have about 65%, 30% protein, and 5% carbs, so a lot more protein here. Low glycemic index diet, some of the articles will talk about use this. So that's 60% fat, 10% carb, 30% protein, but lots of variability in this approach. And then intermittent fasting, this picture cracks me up because it's not that you never eat. It's just that many hours, like maybe, you eat 8 hours and you don't eat the rest of the day. So sometimes you have food on your plate, just not much of the day. All right, and then I just converted this into some other numbers based on a 1,200 calorie diet, what it might look like at various ratios, how many grams of fat you have, how many grams of protein you have, and how many grams of carb you have. So on the true classic 4-to-1, think about it, you get 10 grams of carb for the day. That's not even a slice of bread, or, it's a half a piece of fruit, roughly. It's really negligible amounts of carbohydrate in the classic 4-to-1 and even in the 3-to-1. So, and we do have patients, kids with epilepsy, who we haven't done a ton, but we've done a fair amount, and they do tend to respond well. But you can see, as you go to these other types of diets, it can increase. Modified Atkins tends to have 10 to 15 grams in that neighborhood. So this kind of just helps you to put it in perspective. And then a sample meal, we're looking at salmon with quinoa, broccoli as a sample meal, and how much you can have of the different ingredients, right? So you have salmon in the 4-to-1 would only be 20 grams. That's not even an ounce. So a lipstick tube is like an ounce. So it's a very small amount of salmon, increasing depending on the type of diet. Broccoli is, really, a half a cup is 78 grams. So let's say 80. So it's a quarter of a cup of broccoli. And cream is used in the 4-to-1 or 3-to-1 type of program. It's really hard to make a truly classic ketogenic diet without cream, which I always want to do because I don't want to let saturated fat. But if you're going to use any plant-based oils or fats, they come with a lot of carbs for this type of a diet. So you almost always have to use cream for a classic ketogenic diet. Okay, and then quinoa, you couldn't have that on a 4-to-1 or a 3-to-1, but down here you can have some. So this is how it would lay out. And then we're going to jump into some articles. So Steven, I think this is yours. You're up.
Yep, this is me. So just to reintroduce myself.
I may have to advance the slides for you, Steven, unless I can make you a co-host. Or I think Sharon has that power.
Fine, you can just advance. I'll try and gesture as needed.
Okay.
All right. So just to reintroduce myself, I'm Steve. I'm one of the clinical RDs here. I always had an interest in the ketogenic diet, and frankly, I've had some success with it, both myself and with patients, family members. And I think it could just be a very useful tool for RDs to kind of have in their tool belt, so to speak. Even says it in the title of this article. So without further ado, we're going to dive into this here. So this very low calorie ketogenic diet was compared against a more traditional low calorie diet. in patients with type 2 diabetes and obesity. You can kind of see it got cut off at the bottom. The null hypothesis is that there wouldn't be any significant difference between blood glucose control markers and weight loss between the two diets. And the alternative hypothesis is that there would be differences between blood glucose control markers and weight loss in these diets. So I found the structure of this particular research article pretty interesting in regards to what protocols they followed, and you might be able to pick up on some of them here as I'm going over them, but I'll discuss some of my issues a little bit later. So it was 30 subjects that were randomized to one of the two diets, either the very low calorie ketogenic or the traditional low calorie diet. It was a 12-month study, and all of the patients stopped taking all of their anti-diabetes medications with the exception of metformin. So of the 30, 15 were placed in the ketogenic diet, which was broken down into subsequent phases. In the first phase, it truly wasn't a ketogenic diet. It was a very low calorie diet, less than 800 calories per day, and it provided 1.2 to 1.5 grams per kilogram of protein, which thinking of the thermic effect of food would further kind of reduce caloric intake, possibly increase the metabolic rate. So I found that rather interesting. The way they provided the nutrition was through 4 to 5 meal replacement shakes throughout the day. And this was kind of adhered to for 45 days at that initial phase. During phase 2, they slowly incorporated 1 and then 2 actual whole food meals instead of using the meal replacement shakes for all 5 meals. Carbohydrate intake was reduced to 20 grams per day, and they were encouraged to drink over 2.5 liters of water and use vitamin and mineral supplementation, as a ketogenic diet could be devoid of some of those nutrients. In the later phases, typically stemming from that 45-day period until the 6-month period, they slowly reincorporated carbs, starting with lower GI carbs to try and stop from abruptly ending ketosis production. So by 6 months, all the subjects had reintroduced all carbs, and the researchers had these particular patients kind of start on what they called a maintenance diet of 1,500 to 2,000 calories. They also were counseled on physical activity and healthy lifestyle changes. They didn't denote whether the low calorie group got those as well, which I think is something to mention. Now, when we look at the low calorie diet, they had reduced energy intake 500 to 1,000 calories in comparison to their Harris-Benedict equated needs for maintenance. Their diet plan was 5 small meals throughout the day, Mediterranean style type diet. So as you can see, the protein sources were primarily fish and legumes and eggs, and the carbohydrates were grains, fruits, and vegetables. The macronutrient breakdown is as listed: 30% fat, 20 to 25% protein, about 50% carbs, very nicely incorporated fiber at 25 to 30 grams per day. And they considered it low sodium at less than 5 grams. So do with that what you will. So these are just some baseline characteristics between the two different groups. One thing I did want to mention, which I will later discuss a little bit further, there were some differences at baseline between individuals randomized between the two groups. As we can see by the p-values, the weight, BMI, waist circumference, and hip circumference between the ketogenic diet and the low calorie diet were significantly different. And I think that is important to note, simply because it tends to be easier to lose weight the more weight that you have. They have higher caloric needs. And additionally, when we get into the reporting of the data, they did it based on kind of gross metrics. They didn't do it by percent change, they did it by overall change. That being said, we'll see that they are still some pretty promising results. All other metrics such as blood pressure, A1C, glycemia, cholesterol, and lipid panels, no significant difference. They were comparable. This is just some additional baseline data. The one thing I do want to mention here as well is, if we scroll down to the bottom part, the differences in treatments for their anti-diabetic medications was pretty notable. A good portion of the patients on the ketogenic diet were on more than just metformin or metformin and diet, whereas the low calorie group was strictly on metformin and diet. So one of the things they do report at the end of the study is that there was a reduction in anti-diabetic medication in the ketogenic diet group, but that's because they were on quite a few more of those medications. So it serves the reason.
Mhm.
All right, so this is just the anthropometric data, or the summary of, how the results played out. It's interesting to see that there actually was quite a large difference, and it was statistically significant in the changes in weight, even in that first 3-month period. That's what the T1 indicates for weight, BMI, waist circumference, hip circumference, systolic blood pressure, total cholesterol, LD cholesterol, glycemia, A1C, all for the ketogenic diet group. So we saw we hit those metrics that we were, attempting to measure here. So it looks like it was rather successful. From there, they also evaluated the results from, 12 months once they got them on more of that maintenance diet. And a good deal of the patients continued to see weight loss, even on a maintenance diet. The BMI, as a result, also continued to decline, waist circumference as well. Actually, that looks like that kind of stayed relatively the same from that first metric, but it was declined overall from baseline, and same with hip circumference.
Can you guys see the cursor?
Yes.
Okay, I feel like Vanna White. Okay, go ahead, Steve.
Okay.
And Stephen, you should be able to advance because you're a co-host now.
Oh, okay, so I could always
Okay, good.
advance. Additionally, we did see, like we discussed, the benefits in cholesterol levels. I find it rather interesting, especially with LDL. That's usually a big focus that individuals against the ketogenic diet will make, is they think, how could it possibly be healthy? All this fat, we're going to do, terrible things to the lipid panel, but it actually appears to have been rather beneficial. There was a significant decrease from time, at baseline to time 1, which was the 3-month period, and even further, not significantly different, but still a further decline from baseline to time 2. So I think that goes to kind of be counterintuitive to what people who are against the ketogenic diet may think is a drawback. So pretty much we can say there was a pretty good deal of results here in regards to glycemic index control, looking at the glycemia and the A1C on both timetables, as well as weight. However, looking at the traditional low-calorie diet that was more of a Mediterranean style, a lot less promising results. So there actually was an increase in HDL, not necessarily significant, but it did occur. There were some modest improvements in glycemic control, once again, not statistically significant. And for the most part, weight loss was mostly negligible. A1C seemed to be decreased a little bit, but once again, not statistically significant, and certainly not to the degree of the ketogenic diet. Oh, I don't think I can advance.
I got it.
Okay. So this is the table that I was referring to earlier. This is the difference between baseline and final measurement between the ketogenic diet group and the low-calorie diet group. So that's how this is being measured. So this is the first leftmost column is from baseline to that 3-month follow-up, and the second right column is from baseline to completion of the study. As we can see, they're gross measures. So weight was statistically significantly changed or lowered in favor of the ketogenic diet, as was BMI, as you'd expect. Waist to hip ratio, not so much, no significant change there. On the baseline to completion of the diet, once again, statistically significant improvements in favor of the ketogenic diet in regards to weight and BMI. Looking at the blood pressure, this actually looks a little counterintuitive when they throw in the negatives, but that's to suggest that there were actually alterations that were not beneficial. When we look at the low-calorie diet over here, we see that. And there was a statistically significant change. So we actually had a slight increase in blood pressure parameters for a lot of the low-calorie diet, whereas we had the beneficial changes we were hoping to see in regards to reduction of blood pressure for the very low-calorie ketogenic diet. And furthermore, touching on the A1C values, for the first follow-up period, there was no significant change, as well as for the second, just about tapping it. Not quite there, but showing some pretty promising results nonetheless. So this is just representing graphically the difference that we were just discussing on that previous table. As you can see, significant differences are denoted by the little asterisk. And at both the 3-month follow-up and 12-month follow-up, it appears the very low-calorie ketogenic diet far outperformed the low-calorie Mediterranean style diet. Additionally, BMI changed as a result. As you can imagine, not many people were shrinking or growing during this time period. So with weight decreases, the BMI had subsequent reductions as well. This is a metric to show the A1C levels over time. So in that first 3-month period, which was done appropriately, as A1C typically is the measure of blood glucose control over the 3 months, we do see a statistically significant difference from baseline, much more so in the very low-calorie ketogenic diet, not necessarily reaching significance in the low-calorie diet. And the most promising thing was that those improvements were, for the most part, maintained, even during the more maintenance or reincorporation phase for the very low-calorie ketogenic diet.
That's right. They reintroduced here some carbs, yeah.
Furthermore, they did investigate some rather interesting metrics in regards to cognitive function and overall eating behavior. And that's one of the things anecdotally I will say is during the ketogenic diet, my experience with it, you do notice a change for the better in regards to cognition and kind of mental clarity. And I would even say like emotional response to things as well. N of 1 studies I don't put much thought into, but I thought it was worth mentioning. So here we show cognitive restraint scores were actually better or improved from baseline with the very low calorie ketogenic diet, whereas we cannot see the same results in regards to the Mediterranean style diet. They actually decreased over time. Furthermore, uncontrolled eating behavior was measured based on some questionnaires, and the very low calorie ketogenic diet showed a marked reduce at time period 1 while they were undergoing the keto diet treatment, and were mostly maintained continuing on to, through the remainder of the 12-month study. So better control over eating behaviors, not as much binging or kind of just saying, forget about it, I'm going to eat what I want. They were rather adherent. We cannot say the same for the low calorie diet group. As we see, the scores tended to increase over time, almost as if being so restricted for so long was actually causing these individuals to go off the wagon, so to speak. Even below, we have emotional eating responses. So those declined as they entered ketosis, as we see as the T1. They declined to 5.8 versus the 8.8, a significant decrease, and were relatively well maintained with reincorporation. And then once again, with the low calorie diet, the alternative was true. Actually seemed to have a higher emotional eating score, indicating dietary choices and behavior were more heavily influenced by emotional status and stress. Just to kind of continue to wrap up, this was a health survey questionnaire that they also administered. So this was kind of just how they felt overall while undergoing these different diets and treatments. So for the calorie restricted ketogenic diet, the acronyms are as follows. So physical functioning, role, physical, I'm not sure necessarily what that meant, body pain, general health, vitality, social functioning, emotional role, mental health. They all markedly improved. They were all statistically significant in that ketogenic time period and were maintained at the 12-month follow-up. So quite frankly, people felt better in most facets examined by this short form health survey following the ketogenic diet. And as we could see, no significant improvements were measured by the low calorie diet at either time period. Last but not least, I believe we have the adherence scores, and they were significantly better for the very low calorie ketogenic diet, as we can see there. both at the initial phase and the 12-month follow-up phase. So the people on the more restrictive diet, or so it would appear, actually adhered more closely to the diet. So just to kind of wrap everything up, at both follow-up points, it appears the ketogenic diet had greater reductions in pretty much all of the outcomes measured that we were looking at in regards to glycemic control and weight. The further support they had in regards to the ketogenic diet was improvements in a lot of these symptoms and scores for cognitive restraint, uncontrolled eating, emotional eating, and that overall health survey, quality of life survey they did. And there was no improvement seen in the low calorie group. I think the most interesting thing to denote is that the nutritional adherence was higher in the diet that is traditionally examined as being more restrictive. So anybody who says a ketogenic diet is too restrictive, you can't possibly have people follow that. The biggest obstacle usually is just starting, getting somebody convinced that starting is doable and feasible. And like I said, anecdotally, I could 100% agree with that. There's always some hesitancy, but typically once people are on the diet, they're like, I'm really not hungry, I'm feeling satiated, I get to eat things that are actually kind of satisfying, and tend to be pretty happy on the diet. One of the interesting things that was also looked at in this study was the discontinuation of anti-diabetes medications. As I mentioned, we would assume this would favor the ketogenic diet as those patients were on more anti-diabetic medications. And that is what the results showed. However, when we exclude the anti-diabetic medications being considered and only look at metformin, it still maintained that significant difference. So patients were able to even discontinue metformin or adjust dosages accordingly. So in the final remarks, I kind of liked the way the study reincorporated carbohydrates towards the end. And overall, we could see that there was quite a bit of benefit in regards to all the metrics measured. I do think it is important to note that the very low calorie ketogenic diet provided less calories overall. I mean, they started at less than 800, which is significant, especially for 45 days. That can result in quite a bit of weight loss. And then even adding in additional whole food meals was probably extremely hypocaloric. And then even the maintenance phase appears to be either equal or still slightly less than the study phase for the Mediterranean diet. So that's worth noting. Additionally, I will say those changes in statistics from baseline could be slightly misleading as we didn't look at percentage changes from baseline. However, the fact that all of the metrics appeared to be pretty consistent, I think that this still does hold some water, but it is worth mentioning it would be more effective as a lot of those individuals in the ketogenic diet group were heavier to begin with, have higher metabolic needs, would be easier to lose weight, and 10 kilograms for a 200 kilogram individual is not the same as 10 kilograms for a 100 kilogram individual. So I think that's worth noting. But overall, I would say the alternative hypothesis would be accepted in this experiment. And it kind of just serves as further evidence that a ketogenic diet really can be utilized to aid overweight individuals suffering from issues with blood sugar control, and perhaps even individuals suffering from some kind of mental disorders or issues, predominantly like depression or just kind of displeasure with life. So overall, I thought this was a pretty strong study, although some things could have been improved.
And we'll circle back to some of those points in the very last slide. I'm going to jump in and explain this meta-analysis. So it's also on the same topic, the impact of a ketogenic diet on metabolic parameters in patients with obesity or overweight with or without type 2 diabetes. This was published in 2020. So it was a meta-analysis. So they started off reviewing 3 different databases. 43, 142, and 104 articles were identified from the databases shown here. They went through all their screening, et cetera, and narrowed it down to 14 studies that included RCTs of the metabolic effect of ketogenic diets in patients with overweight or obesity, and that looked at the relationship between a ketogenic diet and glycemic outcomes with or without type 2 diabetes. They had to have the actual raw data and be in English. So they ended up with these 14 studies that included 734 subjects with overweight or obesity. 444 of them had diabetes, 290 did not. And they all had a ketogenic diet arm. And then the other control, they call it control diet arm, they varied. It could have been low calorie, it could have been low fat, low glycemic index, or high carb, low fat. Now I'm going to show you a bunch of slides that all look the same, and I've pointed out the what's significant so we can kind of fly through it a bit. So they're all going to look like this. So on here, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And they were blurry in the actual article, so I apologize for that. But we're going to have the factor that they were looking at. So in this case, fasting glucose. The studies that looked at patients who had diabetes is up on top, and those that did not have diabetes follow. And then on this plot here, if the diamond shapes are to the left, it favors the ketogenic or experimental diet. And if it's on the right, it favors the control diet. Okay, so here for fasting glucose for patients with diabetes, it actually didn't favor the diabetics over the non-diabetics, but for all patients together, because then they collapse it and put them all together, there was a significant effect that fasting glucose was improved when they were on the ketogenic diet. For hemoglobin A1C, as you would expect, for the diabetic patients, it did favor, the ketogenic diet did favor lower hemoglobin A1Cs. Also in the non-diabetic patient, I'm sorry, I'm saying that wrong. The diabetic and then all of them together. Okay, so the non-diabetics only was not significant. For fasting insulin, there was no significant effect for patients with type 2 diabetes because they're insulin resistant, so they make a lot of insulin, right? So there was no effect of ketogenic diet on fasting insulin. Non-diabetics neither, nor combined. For C-peptide, there was nothing significant. And for the HOMA scores, which takes into account both glucose and insulin levels. So it accounts for the hyperinsulinemia that comes with type 2 diabetes. So there was reduced HOMA scores in the diabetic population who would have high insulin, type 2 diabetes, because they're compensating. So it favored the ketogenic diet. So those patients with diabetes and overweight or obesity had improved HOMA scores on a ketogenic diet compared to the control. But not the non-diabetics and not the groups together. For weight, they didn't break it out by diabetes or not, but it was weight loss was favored by the ketogenic diet across all of the studies that looked at that. BMI actually did not end up being significant. It trended 0.08, and waist circumference also trended at 0.09, but wasn't significant. Impacted positively or negatively by the ketogenic diet. Total cholesterol. So here for diabetics, there was no significant impact, but for the non-diabetics, it actually favored the control. So this is a little bit different than what the prior study said, meaning that those that did not have diabetes, the ketogenic diet did not improve their cholesterol, but rather the control diets did. For the non-diabetics, and for everyone combined, it didn't matter. For triglycerides among our diabetic patients, it did favor the ketogenic diet, or the ketogenic diet helped to reduce triglycerides among diabetic patients. No significant impact on non-diabetics, and together it was ketogenic diet was positive. For LDL cholesterol, there was no significant impact of diet on for our diabetics. For the non-diabetics, the non-ketogenic diets, the control diets, were showed an improvement in LDL in the non-diabetic patient, as well as all together. HDL, we know, right, when triglycerides are improved and come down, HDL goes up. So in our diabetic patients, HDL was improved. And here the experimental is on the right. I don't know why they changed it on this one graph, so I had to pick that up. So for the diabetic patients, their HDL improved when they were on the ketogenic diet. Nothing for the non-diabetics, and then all groups combined favored the ketogenic diet. Systolic blood pressure, C-reactive, and diastolic blood pressure, C-reactive protein, and serum creatinine, there was no significant differences. So So in conclusion of this meta-analysis that included a lot of patients, overweight and obesity with type 2 diabetes, patients with those conditions are more likely to benefit via reduced weight and improved glycemic and lipid control from a ketogenic diet. Okay, so now we're going to jump to epilepsy for a few slides and then have kind of a summary slide. So we're at 2:45. Okay, so ketogenic diet, historically, going back to biblical times, it was noticed that starvation can effectively treat seizures. So with starvation, you have ketones. The ketone diet mimics some aspects of starvation, including dehydration and ketosis. When we're treating patients, it could lead to we have had some patients become a little acidotic on the ketogenic diet. And they were not diabetic. These are kids with epilepsy. So it is something you have to monitor, but most kids don't get to that. The ketogenic diet was used starting in 1921 in France, but it decreased in popularity as anti-epilepsy drugs came onto the scene, but now the diet's becoming popular again. I think I missed something. Okay, so this is a study that looked at the efficacy of ketogenic diet, modified Atkins diet, and low glycemic index therapy diet among children with drug-resistant epilepsy. So we'll see that you can have some, especially with kids, some side effects from the ketogenic diet. So the idea here was, can you get similar positive effects with a little bit less restrictive diet? So in this study, they included subjects that were 1 to 15 years of age, had 4 or more seizures per month. They were non-responders to at least 2 anti-seizure medications. They had no prior ketogenic diet therapy. They were randomized to one of 3 diets, a classic ketogenic diet, which they started the kids in the hospital. They started with a 1-to-1 ratio and advanced every 48 hours to 2-to-1, 2.5-to-1, 3-to-1, to ultimately 4-to-1, or they could have been randomized to the modified Atkins diet, which was about a 1-to-1 ratio. Food weighing was not required, but total carbs per day were supposed to be between 10 and 20 grams. And there was some reduced protein. They weren't very specific about that. And they encouraged high-fat diets. They then also compared, or another diet arm was the low glycemic index diet that followed the Johns Hopkins particular program, but it basically restricted high glycemic foods. They had to have a glycemic index, well, say it the other way. They excluded foods that had a glycemic index above 55. You could eat foods that are lower than 55. Parents were provided with education and detailed meal plans. So they screened a bunch of kids. They ultimately ended up with 170 that were randomized to the 3 diet arms. And they had some dropout, but not too bad. So they analyzed data on 52 on ketogenic diet, 52 on modified Atkins, and 54 on the low glycemic diet. Their primary outcome was worded a little odd, I thought, but it was a percentage change in seizure frequency after 24 weeks, but it was powered to determine what they call non-inferiority. So were the modified Atkins and the low glycemic index diet not inferior, or were they similar, basically? So their thinking is that the ketogenic diet could be hard to follow. Can these other diets have similar effects? Now, Steven just went through how it may not be hard to follow, and they have some results too that would support that. The secondary outcomes were seizure reduction greater than 50%, improved social quotient with this survey that they administered. They had another survey for child behavior checklist, and they looked at changes in serum, copper, selenium, and zinc. These are some minerals that we do monitor in patients on a ketogenic diet. Ketones were measured via urinary dipstick, and it was a range of 0 to 4, none, small, moderate, or large ketones in the urine. They monitored tolerance and adverse events, so parents kept logs of all this information, and they conducted interviews with the parents and the caregivers. A minimum of 80% consumption of the prescribed diet was necessary as part of the final inclusion criteria for some of the data that they did. I'll show you in a moment. Their null hypothesis is that there will be no significant difference in seizure reduction percentage between the 3 diets, or I should say between the modified Atkins and the keto, or the low glycemic index therapy and the keto. So seizure activity was logged and compared with previously collected data from 28 days leading up to initiation of randomization to the diet therapy. 12 patients withdrew. We saw this in the chart, 158 were used in the final analysis. And the mean dietary adherence, so for the low glycemic index therapy, it was 94.3%, the ketogenic diet 91.4%, but the modified Atkins was 90.6% were compliant. So the compliance with the low glycemic index therapy was significantly greater than the other two, and the modified Atkins was not. Patients did not adhere to that more so than the ketogenic. Here is our baseline characteristics. So we have the number of kids that were randomized to the ketogenic, or in the first column, the modified Atkins and the low glycemic index therapy. And at baseline, they compared them on a multitude of different things. They did not put the p-values on the chart. They were in the article, however, and there were some things in the clinical examination that were significantly different, but nothing else was significantly different. So in terms of their results, so they're looking at seizure frequency in this table. You have the ketogenic diet in the first column, modified Atkins, low glycemic index therapy. Again, they don't put the p-values on the chart, but in terms of seizure frequency at 24 weeks, they look at both the means as well as the medians. So if we look at the mean, it was 9.4 versus 11 versus 8.7. It was not significantly different. Achieve specific cutoff points after 24 weeks of intervention. So did they have a complete resolution of seizures? We have 6 versus 8 versus 9. What percent had greater than 90% reduction? 6, 6, and 8. Greater than 50% reduction? 23, 13, 15, and less than a 50% reduction. And if there was an increase, none of this was significant. Percent change in seizure frequency, they looked at per protocol versus intent to treat. So for an intent to treat analysis, you do your stats on everybody that was randomized. That's the intent to treat. But if the diet's harder to comply with, then, and you really want to know what the diet does, you look at per protocol analysis. So this would only include those that actually complied. But intent to treat does capture the difficulty in complying, but no significant differences. On this graph here, we have a number of patients, those on the ketogenic diet, modified Atkins in the middle, and the low glycemic index therapy. And the darker green is a greater than 50% reduction. So there is trending towards a little bit, a greater number of patients having greater than 50% reduction, but it's not statistically significant. Then they looked at difference in seizure reduction with the 3 treatment strategies as per protocol analysis, again, median and mean, and the intent to treat. So per protocol includes only those that actually followed it, and they compared the ketogenic to the modified Atkins and the ketogenic to the low glycemic index therapy. And they did the same thing with intent to treat. And again, there was no significant difference, which I actually find a little hard to believe, honestly, because when we do the ketogenics with the ketogenic diet with the kids that we start and we follow them, we tend not to get improvements in seizure control until they are actually in ketosis. Now, by blood work. So this was interesting, but I will say we've been trained by folks at the Charlie Foundation to actually start at a less restrictive ratio, like 2 to 1, 2.5 to 1, and then go to 3, and then go to 4 if need be. So the researchers determined that in comparison to a ketogenic diet, both the low glycemic index therapy and the modified Atkins were appropriate alternative approaches. The non-inferiority criteria was met, and there were comparable rates of seizure reduction between basically all of them. Interestingly enough, the modified Atkins actually showed lower adherence rates than the traditional ketogenic diet. Much as what Steven was saying is what people report to me is that when you're on a ketogenic diet, you don't feel hungry, or you don't feel as hungry. Of note, 10 patients all receiving this particular medication showed hypercalciuria at 24 weeks. In the modified Atkins group, 2 patients developed scurvy, interestingly, at 24 weeks, and 3 patients developed prolonged QTC intervals detected at 24 weeks. So you do have to check micronutrient levels. Children in the ketogenic and the modified Atkins group had significant reductions in serum selenium. However, levels remained within the reference range. So there are criteria you're supposed to follow in terms of monitoring labs. Across all the 3 diets, patients with increased patients with an increased 50% seizure reduction rate were comparable. Okay, so basically there was no difference. So the null hypothesis is accepted. The trial suggests even for epileptic seizure reduction, alternative nutrition approaches modifying carbohydrate and fat intake can provide similar benefits to a ketogenic diet while adhering to less strict parameters. And again, just noting that there can be significant side effects and that patients need to be monitored. So this is basically saying the same. So in terms of here at Stony Brook, the criteria that we follow, so patient has to want to follow, the patient's family, because a lot of times it's very young children, need to be on board because they have to buy a completely different set of food. We have found kids that are tube fed. It's definitely easier because you just give them the appropriate formula, although I have one mom who makes all the tube feeding formulas from scratch. They typically fail medication treatment, but I had one child who I'll share some data on her who followed it for a very long time, and her parents never wanted to put her on anti-epilepsy drugs. She had very mild auras, so they chose to not try the drugs until she went away to college and the diet was too hard to follow. It can be the first line of treatment in a particular metabolic disorder. We have to be caution with metabolic disorders, fatty acid oxidation problems, and you have to measure carnitine levels. You have to do a carnitine panel before you start to make sure that they have adequate carnitine, and then repeat that, because with all of the fatty acid oxidation and getting all this long chain fatty acids into the mitochondria, you can become depleted in carnitine. So you have to monitor that. Caution with family history of kidney stones, and it's contraindicated with beta oxidation defects. So remember, you have to be able to do that. And there are some metabolic disorders where patients can't do that. If there's a problem with heme biosynthesis or a pyruvate carboxylase deficiency, inability to maintain adequate nutrition. So I just show you here what the pyruvate dehydrogenase enzyme does. It's involved with getting your 2-carbon acetyl-CoAs from pyruvate. So if you don't have this enzyme, you can't follow this diet. We go through a lot of preparation to really determine if it's an appropriate diet for a small child and their families. We use a tool called Keto Diet Calculator, which I'll share with you in a minute. We give parents resources. They have to change their medications to the lower carb, lower sugar forms. They have to buy a food scale and a way to measure either your dipsticks for urine or finger stick meter for ketones. A lot of education has to go on. They have to start trying some recipes. We have to work with the physicians to change all the medications over and consider if there's any feeding issues or concerns. So if you are interested in using a ketogenic diet for anything, the Charlie Foundation is a great resource. If you want to use a ketogenic diet to treat children with epilepsy at your workplace, then you really should go to the Charlie Foundation's training and get access to this keto diet calculator. I could never calculate these diets without this resource. It's an incredibly useful tool, which I'll share with you in a moment. These are some different formulas that we use. So KetoCal was the first one we started using. There's also a product called Keto V, and now Functional Formularies has come out with a not as ketogenic, but a formula that you can use depending on the therapy that or the ratio you're trying to achieve. So we use a variety of these different products. To determine the nutrient needs for your patient, I would recommend use the keto diet calculator, because in here, once you put the desirable weight in, this is a field that you enter. You can enter it in kilograms or pounds. It gives you the recommended calorie range. And then this is a big person. Oh, this was the end when I was weaning her off. This is the young woman I had who we started in 2012 on a 4-to-1. And then in 2019, we were weaning her off. So on the 4-to-1, it's a little bit more calorie restricted. As you get more liberal ratios, you get more liberal calorie ranges as well. So for this person, she did really well on the ketogenic diet for a really long time. She had some breakthrough seizures, but not much. And then she did have a breakthrough seizure. She wanted to drive and she was going away to college. So they made the decision to switch her to medication and wean off the ketogenic diet because it's really hard to do as a college student. So we changed her, we helped her to wean off. But when you put in the desired weight, it'll tell you the daily goal as well as the per meal goal for grams of fat, protein, and carbohydrate, and protein and carb combined. So this is another example of another person. This child has some disabilities, so had a very low calorie need. So we did 900 calories at 3-to-1. They were 3-to-1 ratio, and they were enterally fed. Oh, this is the woman, the young girl whose mother makes her tube feedings by scratch at home. So for the day, she needs to take in 87 grams of fat, 27 grams of protein, almost 28, only 1.3 grams of carb. And that's the protein and carb together. And then per meal, that comes down to this. So one of the recipes, so this is another part of the keto diet calculator. Mom and I've taught her how to do this. She changes up the vegetables, she changes up the ingredients. But on this particular one, we did 21 grams of spinach, 23 grams of dark meat, chicken, 19 grams of olive oil. And it'll suggest to you the goal, which is down here, the bottom line. And then as you change your gram amounts of these ingredients, it changes the numbers in yellow. And you want to get as close as possible, like really close to the goal. And then parents have to weigh this out to the gram and use a spatula to get every speck off. And she multiplies this. This is a single serving. So she does make it in batches. So she multiplies this out to make larger batches. And then they have such great blenders now. So you can use one of those really fabulous blenders. And then we have to supplement. So this is, again, a homemade tube feeding formula. If you're starting out with a keto cal, you won't need to have as intricate supplement plan as this. But you can see it's like really small amounts of food. So you're not getting much nutrition. You're not getting much vitamins and minerals from the actual food. So we have to play around a lot with supplements to meet her needs. So you can put in different, it has a search tool. You can put in different products. It calculates the amount. It also tells you how much carb is coming from all your supplements because you have to make sure you're not using up too much carb here. And then it tells you the actual amount that's coming in from that mix of supplements in the yellow. Percent DRI is to the left, and then it gives you the upper limit too for the appropriate RDA for her age and gender, and you make sure that you're not doing too much of any one thing. So this is a huge help. These are the labs that we check prior to starting a ketogenic diet. You have this handout. I'm not going to go too much into this, but again, if you're interested in doing this at your hospital, we have lots of unplanned admissions for this, but planned admissions, the whole process that we follow. This is for tube-fed patients. Then for PO patients, that's a lot harder because we have to make up these menus and translate that to food in the kitchen and individualize it for the patient. These are labs you should follow pre-diet, during admission or initiation of the diet, and then 1 and 3 month post-diet initiation every 3 months until stable, and then every 6 to 12 months. Patients can use the urine dipsticks, but we much prefer now that these finger stick monitors that can measure both glucose and ketones. It's much more accurate to measure in the blood. There are possible adverse effects. We have to monitor for hypoglycemia, tell them how to deal with that. Excessive ketosis can be a problem. MSS can be a problem. We haven't really seen that so much. Unstable medication levels, I haven't seen that too much either. Dehydration, we have to be careful and monitor and make sure that we tell them how much water to provide. Some common side effects, they can slip into acidosis. So there are supplements like Fosnac that we use for that. Nausea, vomiting during initiation, I really haven't seen that. Weight loss, I have seen. Constipation, I have seen. I have not seen diarrhea. We did see hyperlipidemia in some of our kids, and we have not seen any of these more unusual complications. The role of the dietitian, we're integrally involved in planning these diets and monitoring and seeing these patients. And this is just some meals to show you what they look like. I take recipes from the Charlie Foundation, individualize it for the patient, and Charlie Foundation has great pictures and directions. So this was an omelet, cheese omelet. This is flax hemp chia seed porridge with sliced banana, and it's 27 grams of banana, which is a very small amount. Tuna salad with mayo, quesadilla with sour cream and tomatoes. A little bit on the timeline. So you have diet initiation, maintenance. When parents are monitoring, we're monitoring. We follow up and check labs. And then after about 3 years, it's recommended that you could try to titrate off the diet and that the beneficial effects may be sustained. And the last slide might give us some indication as to why. But if you read the Charlie Foundation website and case studies, you'll see that. So this is okay. So to Steven's point, and what I think as RDs, we're kind of trained to not think this could be a good thing, right? So at the end last night, I'm like, I know it can really benefit for type 2 diabetics. I've used it for type 2 diabetics, but what about inflammation? And what about oxidative stress? So I typed that in last night quickly, and I come up with this: antioxidant and anti-inflammatory activity of a ketogenic diet. So there's research to show that it actually reduces inflammation and can be neuroprotective in cognitive and central nervous system disorders like Alzheimer's. But there's also literature to the opposite. So glucose and lipid homeostasis and inflammation in humans following an isocaloric ketogenic diet. So I really think it comes down to you have to individualize and monitor for any of your patients, and that there's probably genetic predispositions or SNPs that are going to help some people benefit more than others. But we should keep an open mind, and some patients will benefit and want to try it, and we should help them do it in the best way they can and monitor. Then the last article I found, which was so interesting, is ketogenic diet and microbiota, friends or enemies, because that was the other thing that was always concerning me. Well, on a ketogenic diet, are we going to have negative effects on the gut microbiome? Depends on how you define negative. This was a very interesting article, review article, and very theoretical. So I'm going to go through this a little bit, but this is just proposed. This hasn't been proven. There's some evidence to support some of it, but it's just a schematic from those particular authors. So they're saying, okay, so if you have a diet that's it's ketogenic diet, so you have high ketone bodies and low glucose, blood glucose. They also talk about taking ketone supplements, and that you can have a more liberal carbohydrate diet and still get some of the benefits by supplementing with ketones, which I thought was really interesting. So now we're going to follow a few of these different lines. So the diet itself can have impact on different tissues. That's these light colored lines, but the diet, kind of the thing that they're focusing on here, is the gut microbiome. So let's follow this first. So you follow a ketogenic diet. What does it do to your gut microbiome? It does decrease diversity, decreases richness in gut bacteria, increases bacteroides, and has some changes in specific microbes. Now, this is all, there's thousands of different microbiota. They all have their own genetic SNPs and change what they make based on your diet. It's incredibly complicated, but this is what they are finding. It's really complicated. But some of these things I tend to think aren't good, like decrease in bifidobacteria, I wouldn't think is a good thing. But these are the changes that they saw. And then the diet itself, plus the impact of the change in the gut microflora, can impact fat cells to decrease liposynthesis, increase lipid oxidation. We've been talking about that, and potentially increase adiponectin, which is a cytokine produced by fat cells that's anti-inflammatory. So that's a good thing. Combined or changes in the gut microflora can decrease glycemia, increase short chain fatty acids, which I'm like, really? Because we just decreased the bifidobacteria. So that doesn't sit well with me, but maybe the other microbes can make a lot of it, and improved insulin sensitivity. Then the ketogenic diet has an impact on the GI tract. The microflora changes also, you can imagine, of course, impacts the GI tract. We have a decrease or an increase in short chain fatty acids, an increase in sulfur, which might not be a good thing, especially for inflammatory bowel, a decrease in lactate, increase in luminal pH. Hold this thought for a minute. Then the change in the gut microbiome, as well as the ketogenic diet, can impact the central nervous system. From the microbiome, you might have some increased short chain fatty acids that cross the blood-brain barrier, and then decreased gamma glutamyl amino acids, which might impact some neurotransmitter synthesis. So that's from the change in the microflora. Then the change in the diet itself, plus the change in the that happens in the gut. All these three things come together. Well, from the gut first, you can impact vagus nerve activation, neuropeptides and neurotransmitters produced in the gut, immune signaling, because the gut associated lymphoid tissue is right there, and intestinal hormones. And then altogether, the diet, the impact of on the GI tract and the microflora itself on the central nervous system can lead to all of these factors in the central nervous system, including changes in neurotransmitters, lots of different neurotransmitters, and other hormones and signaling cascades. This is some of the theoretical ways that might help. Ketogenic diet may help prevent or treat Alzheimer's disease, and the anti-seizure effects. So for epilepsy, and it can lead to an increase in GABA, probably has to be studied more, and change or an increase in the GABA to glutamate ratio. So I believe, am I remembering this? Glutamate is stimulatory and GABA is not. So lots of research needed, but really interesting things to think about. And I think we just need to keep an open mind to ketogenic diet potential, especially for patients that really do want to try it, help them do it in as healthy a way as they can, and help them monitor with the physician who can order labs, the impact of that. Because some people will have, I think, a good effect I've seen in some of my patients, and some not. Potentially. Some are going to have. One of my patients, that the young girl that was on it for so many years, she really did have a high an increase in total and LDL cholesterol, and we used sugar-free Metamucil to help manage that. And she did have constipation too, which the Metamucil helped, and MCT oil. So I thought we'd be 10 minutes late. We're at 3:11, so it's a pretty good estimate. We'll take some questions. Anybody have any questions at all? I hope it was interesting.
It was very interesting, and I think it opened my eyes a lot more to the possibilities.
Good.
Thank you both for an excellent presentation.
Thanks, Alyssa. Stay in
You're
touch with
welcome.
us. You can always join our journal clubs.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Make sure we have your new email.
Okay.
Anybody else? Any questions, thoughts? Anyone try it themselves, or know family members that have tried a ketogenic diet, or patients? Any experience with it?
Very little experience with it.
Okay. I have one patient who I've worked with for years and on a low calorie diet, and she could not be successful. She was morbidly obese. She got pregnant and had really difficult pregnancy because of her obesity. And after the pregnancy, she had a healthy baby. She wanted to get pregnant again, but she wanted to deal with her weight first and her diabetes. So she came to me saying, I am doing this. And one of the family physicians as well, I want you to help me and to help me monitor it. And we did. And she was so happy that someone would listen to her and help her try this, because these are the kind of foods she liked. She was not, after years of trying, she was not successful on the traditional low carbohydrate diet. And she was really successful on the ketogenic diet.
We do have a question in the chat as well.
Oh, what percentage of carb do you recommend for type 2 diabetic patients? So honestly, I tend to start around 40%. I will go to 35%. I haven't necessarily started anyone on a ketogenic diet except my children with epilepsy, unless they ask me. But let me backtrack too. Many years ago, Lorraine was with me, I think, like 20 years ago. We used to do what do we call it? Protein sparing modified fast, right? Which is basically the very low calorie
clinic also.
Yeah. And we had great results. Type 2 diabetics lost weight. They got off their diabetic medication. They felt fabulous. And it was not that hard to follow. Like, they felt full, they felt satiated, but I could not get them, and maybe I shouldn't have, to transition to a more moderate carb diet without them exploding in terms of weight. And so then I don't think I had anyone who I was able to introduce some carbs, which I really felt like I had to do. Maybe we don't have to do. And so then we stopped doing it because they would gain so much weight back. They would gain more weight back than how they started.
That was
So
also our experiences as well.
yeah. And we did OptiFast years ago. So yeah, so you know, I might, I don't know. I'm wrapping my head around it because I was always concerned about the inflammation, the change in the gut microbiome, and I still am a little bit because the changes I see here, I don't pretend to be an expert in the gut microbiome, so, but I know bifidobacteria is supposed to be good, and I don't like that they go down. I don't like that there's a decrease in the diversity because everything I've read is that the more diverse your microbiome is, the better. So I'm not, I don't know. I still have kind of mixed feelings, but if a patient really wanted to follow it, I would help them.
My own
I can-
first, somebody else popping in?
Oh, sorry. I was
Go
just gonna say something about fat quality. Do you think it's difficult to keep good fat quality? Because then, I feel like people, one of the draws of the ketogenic diet is they think, they could just eat a lot of bacon, and then with more saturated fat, there's that LPS from bad bacteria that can cross the gut border more. So maybe that's related to some of the increased inflammation in some of the studies if people have some
It'd be
dysbiosis
interesting
going
to measure.
on.
It'd be interesting to measure the gut permeability, right? On a ketogenic diet, does your gut, because we always think high fiber for gut permeability. What would you say, Stephen?
So in regards to that, that's probably the largest obstacle in doing this with a practical sense, is getting patients to understand that that's not the type of diet that you're going to be trying to establish them on. You're not putting them on a diet that's going to reduce their overall health or cause any kind of detriment when the goal is to, promote health and for weight loss. So in the circumstances when I've used this, I was very, mindful. I didn't use a traditional 4-to-1 with a lot of the individuals I've worked with and in my own personal practice. And I did tend to utilize a lot of the net carb concept. You find you can maintain pretty high level of ketones incorporating quite a bit of fiber or quite a bit of carbohydrates if you use fiber. I did tend to supplement with a probiotic as well, just because I was concerned about that. I had used MCT oil. So all things worth considering is you can kind of tailor the diet in that regard using supplements, kind of alternative approaches. In regards to the inflammation, I think it also depends on how exactly they're measuring the inflammation, because it's my understanding that ketogenic diet in its first initial phases is actually pro-inflammatory, but what happens is it's almost like a hermetic stressor in a sense where your body's endogenous antioxidant system actually increases to such a degree that the net result is negative. So glutathione peroxidase tends to be improved to such a degree where it offsets and actually improves inflammation against that increased inflammation from abundance of reactive oxygen species from oxidative metabolism. So I think that's worth mentioning and could possibly be something that causes the differences in the data that we examined, and also the nature of what particular fats, like Andrea had mentioned, are being incorporated as part of the ketogenic diet. As we know, some are far more inflammatory than others.
I don't know if anyone from our bariatric centers here. I think Megan was seeing patients, but I wonder if they use it over there at all.
Do you have any, I don't know if you said this before, it's Katie at
Kate.
WTC. Hi. Do you have any like ketone strips that you recommend using, like for patients who want to do it and make sure that they're in ketosis? Because just from what I know about keto, it's really hard to stay in full ketosis, like depending on the person. Like you could eat broccoli and be out of ketosis. So is there like a brand that you recommend, Steve? Or I don't know.
I want to start by mentioning is the ketone strips, the urinary ones, are a great resource when you're first starting.
Okay.
It's not something that's been heavily researched in like academic criteria, but if you were to actually look at like any kind of forums or any people who do this as more of a lifestyle choice, it tends to be over time, you don't spill as many ketones. Your body seems to do a better job of either getting rid of them through respiration or just utilizing and making a more appropriate level. So I've done this a number of times on and off. I found the best results and the most accurate measures I got is there actually are quite a few glucometers that will measure ketones. Like
Okay.
That's
Oh,
one,
yeah.
for example, or I used one called Keto Mojo that was relatively affordable, and the strips were available on Amazon. And I really felt that that was the best measure, because at one point I still had the urinary strips and I tested them, and it was saying, pretty much negligible ketosis. And I tested my blood ketones and I was over 1.5, which I would deem to be, at least moderate.
Gotcha.
So
Yes.
1.5. So for the
Thank you.
kids with epilepsy, we try to get them to 4. But again, now we're starting to
Mhm.
say, well, maybe 3 is okay. Maybe we don't have to get them to 4. And
And-
let's see.
And the difference being is when we're trying to stop seizures, I think the threshold that you're aiming for is much higher than when we're trying to promote weight loss, satiety, and look for the more minor side effects or benefits, I would say. We're not dealing with something as drastic and life-altering as, crippling seizures.
Makes sense. Thanks.
Any other questions? Well, I'm not going to lie, it was a little stressful putting this together. I read so much last few days, and Steven jumped in and did a great job. Actually, we put this together, but on a very short time frame and over email a lot. So Steven, I stole one of the articles. I ended up presenting one of the articles that you did the work on. So I want to acknowledge that.
I appreciate it. So.
All right, folks. Thanks so much. Hope you got a lot out of it. And again, truly, truly, truly thank you for precepting our interns. I know it's incredibly stressful to be in healthcare right now, like incredibly over the top stressful. So the fact that you are helping us with the interns and training the next generation is so much appreciated. I can't even begin to tell you. Thank you so much.
You're very welcome.
Okay, folks.
Can I just say hi to Leanne, I think, who's on here? I haven't heard from her since she graduated, so I just wanted to say hi.
I saw Leanne, bud. I saw
Hi,
that
how
name.
are you?
Good.
Josephine, if somebody wanted the recording, how would they get it?
Sharon.
I will work my magic and put it on YouTube, and I'll get it out to everybody.
Oh, aren't we cool? We have a YouTube channel.
We're not that cool, Joe.
Kathleen Carosa has
Subscribe.
she had to work, so she couldn't be here. So she wanted to know if she could get the recording.
Yep, no problem.
Okay, thank you.
Oh, and I can't leave out Caitlin either, because I see she's on here. I haven't heard from her much either.
Michelle, Caitlin, that's
But-
working here now? Which Caitlin?
Oh, I thought it was the other Caitlin.
I'm
we
not
had
sure.
2. Sorry. Well, I'm still happy they're here.
Yeah. All right, folks. Have a great day, a great week, and a happy holiday season.
Thank you, you too.
Okay.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
Bye-bye.
Take care, everyone.